Should be nice and hot either way you go. And Blair, if you move over to your right further, you can actually reach back to the board probably easier. Keeping your eye on that firewire cable. Check 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Do we have audio? Check 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And back to 1. Back to 1 and back to 2. Well, do we have a shotgun mic that's up? All shotgun mics should be off. If you do that, then it'll take some of the room right out. Cool, we good?
Mr. Gross, right there. Close to a microphone, of course. Am I close to a plug? No, not exactly.
Ah. Well, no, I'm sure it does. I'm sure I can take this down. Just check that. Ah. Okay. That's easily done. I think it's all done. I think we're ready to go. All I have to do is walk up and click on it.
You don't have a remote, but I can control it from down there. I brought mine back home, but then just assumed you'll say, well,
Let me see what this place comes stocked with.
We're out of our usual premises.
Yeah, this is not our usual site.
Okay.
But I'll see what I can find for you. We'll get word for you.
Okay. I mean, I can always present from here. It's not the end of the world, but it's more, if anyone else is sitting down informally, I might as well sit down informally.
I'll see what I can find.
How long do I have? 10 minutes.
Oh, it's okay.
Can I start? Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Ni hao. Good. That's good. That's a good reply. Good reply. Once again, I really do want to thank you all for coming short distances and long distances to attend what I hope is going to be a really, really interesting conference for all of the participants. We anticipate that it will be very important and very helpful for those of us who are here at USC, because we are very, very, very interested in what your views are, your diverse views coming from different institutions and different academic disciplines. I want to thank once again the Sham family for being so generous with their endowment of this lecture series, which has really made all of this possible. And it really is the individual vision and forward-looking nature of Wellen Sham and Sharon to make this really happen. So I just want to give them one more round of applause. I also want to thank the folks who actually really put this together, and that is Mei Fong and her colleagues. May stand up. I think this deserves that. Mei has just recently joined us from the PRC, and she hit the ground running and put this together in a record amount of time. It was wonderful. It is my pleasure to lay out some of the ground rules and expectations for this conference. First of all, it's going to be a little bit odd. It's going to be a little bit weird. And it's going to be a little bit odd, and it's going to be a little bit weird, because rather than having just academic papers presented on one's ongoing research, we have invited you all here to do something a little bit different. You are all senior, seasoned, smart, sophisticated scholars, and we want to take advantage of the breadth of your vision, your experience, and your understanding of your fields to ask broader questions, which in academic terms we might say are more meta questions, broader questions. So I would like you to consider 4 questions, if you would, please. And so there will be a test on these questions. You'll all be asked to submit your papers, and we will grade you on the answers. But here are the 4 questions that I would like you to consider. Number 1, in the area in which you are an expert, how much attention is devoted to those kinds of questions? This is a quantitative question. Given the field of scholarship for which you are an expert, is this an issue that is deeply covered or not much covered at all? So that's question number 1. Question number 2 is, what is the quality of the research that is being done in this area? So one can imagine, mass communications or organizational communications or studies of journalism, a lot of work, but the quality is medium, or a little bit of work and the quality is high. So I'm going to ask you to grade the fields in which you operate, high, medium, or low, in terms of quality. Thirdly, in your view, what are the 2 most important and interesting questions of research that you believe need more attention? So you might have some questions that you think are very important and critical, but they're receiving a lot of attention. But the third question is, what are the 2 most important and interesting questions that are under-examined? Then the final question, which is really an interesting one, and Jay Wang and Fan and I have been doing some research on this, which is still not quite ready for publication yet, but we're continuing to work on it, and we hope this conference will inform it, is, are there distinctive approaches between East and West for the study of communications in China? Is there a uniquely Chinese view of communications? Is there a uniquely Western view of communications? Now, of course, because we're all sophisticated about this, perhaps maybe there's a UK view and there's a continental Europe view, as it is in some other fields of study that I'm familiar with. So maybe there's a Shanghai view and a Beijing view, which was suggested by our colleague today in her talk. But I would like you to answer those 4 questions. The next and probably final point is we really want to do this and stick to the 10-minute limit, at least as for the initial presentation. I know many, many of you have flown many, many miles, and you say, I've come all this way and I'm only going to speak for 10 minutes? And the answer is absolutely yes. We have invited you all this way, and we only want you to speak for 10 minutes. In your initial presentation, we have deliberately kept this to be a small group. There was pressure to have double or triple the number of people in the room. We chose not to do that, so there would be the possibility for exchange of ideas, and that's really what we're looking for. This is a school of communication, and we want to communicate, and we want to encourage communication and debate and discussion back and forth. So with that, I will say 谢谢, and I will ask Dr. Zhao to come to the podium and make a few remarks as well. Dr. Zhao, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, if I may, I would like to thank on behalf of the invite participants to the Annenberg School, especially Dean Wilson and everybody else, for their vision, leadership, and extraordinary commitment and effort to put together this very exciting event at a very important moment in the development of both the communication study field in general and in the study of issues related to media communication and China. Also, I want to thank them for the privilege to involve me in the planning of this conference, and also sent one of my articles as a provocative, as a piece to in Chinese saying as a 抛砖引玉, throughout the break to bring out the jades. And I know when this piece was being sent out, I was worried, and then Larry, I think, was the one who said, "Don't worry, so long as you have thick skins." And I said, "Yes, I do." So I am very excited about this event, and I was asked to say a few words about the conceptual overview. I couldn't possibly do this, actually, and I think Dean Wilson has already given us the march orders. But I will just add a few things, which the first point is I've been struggling about what exactly we are studying or we're talking about in this room. The conference billed itself as China Media Studies. And at the center of this, of course, is what Dean Wilson was talking about. That is there such a thing as a Chinese, uniquely Chinese communication studies? At the same time, and of course, between the term media and communication, there's a tremendous difference. Because by saying communication, I think it helped us, although the term media is always more elegant, shorter even, that serves a lot of purpose. But I think it's very important to move beyond media-centric view to look at communication as a broad social process, and also the entire process of a social transformation. Also, I'm sometimes thinking, is it Chinese communication or Chinese media studies, or is communications issues or communication issues relate to China or even Chinese? Because if you talk about China, you think of that country there. But if you talk about Chinese, then you think about also Chinese communities outside, the mainland China proper, or other Chinese societies. Also, what about issues such as American media coverage of China, which I think are very important, or for the sake of it, Indian media coverage of China. I think these issues are all very important. So I would like to suggest that while we're focusing on China as such, but move beyond media centrism, but also move beyond China as singular unitary entity, which again, following Louis' talk, it's very clear that there's no such a thing as China. There are many Chinas. Somebody was speaking actually, Huang Gao talked about one China, four worlds. Different parts of China actually were different worlds. So this also helped, I think. So one is at the kind of sub-national level, which argument that was made very eloquently in Professor Sheng Wanning's paper for this conference. At the same time, we need to go upscale, like Sheng Wanning was suggesting, to study the transnational dimension of what is China. Also, in today's context, people talk about Chimerica, Chindia, right? So the transnational regional alliances people, the Shanghai people, do they have more in common with people in the interiors, or do they have more in common with people in LA, or New York, or Tokyo, or Rio? Everywhere, the different type of similar people in different countries, but in similar socioeconomic status. So also I think another point is, while it is very important to think about comparative perspective, that's why we're so happy to have scholars who focus on East Europe, or focus on India, or of course, many scholars here who focus on the U.S. media or many other media in other places. But also it's very important, I think, for us to focus, to think China and the communication issues in world historical terms, because unlike, compare apple and orange, China and the U.S. are not apple and oranges, because like Professor Louis was saying, the Chinese journalists were very, very enchanted by American notions of professionalism. Earlier era, the Chinese media system was shaped by the Soviet Union system, the Leninist system. So it's not an apple-orange comparison. It's more a world historical structural inference. And I think this is something I myself has been grabbing as well. Since Dean Wilson has already gave us the marching orders, I won't say anything more about our objective or that, but I concur with him that we're focusing on the broad perspective, new ways of thinking, and also new ways of even just asking questions. Talk about whether there's such a thing as a Chinese or perspective. I happen to have this quote by Robert Merton, who actually is a founding father of our discipline in many ways. So he was saying, of course, it's very simplistic, saying the Europeans imagines and the North Americans observes. The North American conduct research on a short-term basis. The European speculates on long-term basis. The North American knows what he's talking about. The European doesn't know what he's talking about. I know this is very offensive, and of course, that was the contract, but in many ways, I know somebody might not be very happy hear that. You too. Okay, well, okay, but what's important is that in here we don't have the Chinese. The Chinese haven't even arrived yet. Now we have a bunch of Chinese in this room, and they were educated in Europe, in North America, and then a bunch of us who are from the peripherals, Australia, Canada. I don't know whether we belong. But it's interesting through the study that Dean Wilson and Jay Wall did, that it looks like the Chinese were good at mediative reflection. And also another thing I know is that, or at least for this Chinese, Canadian Chinese, that we do know that we do not know sometimes what we are talking about. And especially in the communication field, there's such a sense of anxiety as to, we think, especially mainland Chinese scholar circles, that is, what are we studying? Our scholarship is so bad. We don't match, North American standards. What are we talking about? So I think it's that sense of anxiety, that sense that at least we know that we don't know what we are talking about, that gives the open opportunity for us to think as a collective, as a community. What are the important research questions? What are the most important problems that we need to deal with? Since in the paper I sent around, the published one already talked about the 5 R's. I'm not going to talk anything more on that. All I can throw out is that I feel that we are struggling over a number of Dean Wilson reminded me the term, or I relearned from him, non-antagonistic contradictions. And this involves a whole series of issues I won't get into, but mostly, for example, the question between the focus on institution, policy, industry versus the focus on everyday experience, subjectivities, identities. Focus on economy and technology. We have asked so many questions about what is, how the market economy is going to change China, how the internet is going to change China, how the new media is going to change China. But at the same time, I think there's the other dimension that we study less is the importance of history, culture. And for myself, you know, I was compelled to do this when suddenly Falun Gong erupt, and I said, oh, what is this about? There are other tensions or non-ethnic contradictions. I won't list more, but I think another one very important is the relationship between knowing the world and changing the world. Scholarship, methods, and the practice. And that's something, our relationship with our constituents. For example, industry, students, all that. And I think these are very important questions. I hope I'm looking forward to learn a lot from everybody in this room. Thank you.
Hello, hello. All right, good afternoon, everyone. A couple of updates. So you know bathrooms are right outside the hall, so everyone knows where the bathrooms are located. Also, there have been some changes to the original conference program. If you'd like an updated copy, you can just go outside of these doors and obtain an updated conference program. All right? So my name is Robeson Frazier. I'm an assistant professor at the Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. I am privileged today to moderate, which basically means make sure that our participants adhere to their time restraints as well as keep the dialogue flowing, this first panel, all right, which is on Chinese communications in a world historical context, continuities and ruptures. All right, today we have Professor Colin Sparks, Professor Zhongdang, Professor Daya Thussu, and Professor Judy Polumbaum. All right. Each person has 10 minutes to present, and we will then move to dialogue and discussion. And questions can be, asked from the participants and people in the crowd, and we look forward to this discussion. So, Professor Sparks, if you don't mind, you are first. That's and actually you can present from right here. I'll just move this microphone. Is that all right?
No, I need to see the screen because
okay.
There's a PowerPoint. Well, I was asked to talk about post-communist media, so post-communist media I shall talk about. But in terms of Dean Wilson's 4 questions, I can answer those fairly easily. How much attention is devoted to China? Precious little. What is the quality of the research? Very low. What are the most interesting questions? Well, that's going to be the substance of what I talk about. And are there distinctive versions of the Eastern and Western approaches? I don't know. So, having done my duty, I shall now return to my... I'm going to try, I'm not going to manage in 10 minutes, to give a brief review of the main accounts of post-communist media. I'm going to give a comparative review of the evidential basis for those theories. I'm going to sketch an alternative that provides a better account of the evidence. And I'm going to consider what it means particularly for the Chinese media. I guess I'm not going to get to the end, but I'm going to try to do as much as I can. So, in the beginning, I think we're all agreed about the starting point for studying post-communist media. That is communist media. And I don't think there's going to be any argument, so I'll just rattle through this. Single-party rule, top-down control by the party control over most areas of life, party control over media, party control over editorial staffing, and so forth, and propaganda, rather than economics, the key driving force. I think that's fairly well established and fairly well known. True in Eastern Europe, true in Russia, true in China. Of course, there are local differences, but that's the fundamental shape of the thing. And today, in Eastern Europe, there's probably relatively little disagreement about the general outcomes. Imperfect multi-party politics. Within the European Union, we have what I'm going to call Schumpeterian democracies, and that's a very important reservation. There are commercially driven media. There are highly partisan media, particularly television. This, in terms of Helen Mancini, which I will criticize a little later on, is a Mediterranean model of polarized political media. And we certainly don't have the New York Times in the newspaper press, and we don't have the BBC in broadcasting. And that, those I think were the ideals that people aspired to 20 years ago in 1989. How do we explain this? The dominant paradigm of change is derived from political science. It often calls itself transitology. Being political scientists, they seldom have much to say about the mass media. They will just say, a democratic society requires a free and independent mass media, full stop, let's move on to something else. If you read Dahl's book, a famous book on democracy, for example, that's about what he says. We've spent our career saying, just a minute, things are a little bit more complicated than that. But this is the dominant tradition. It identifies itself as studying purely the political transition to what is specifically a Schumpeterian model of democracy. Just for those of you who are not familiar with the political science literature, Schumpeter argued against theories of direct democracy and against theories of representative democracy. In Schumpeter's model, the definitional characteristic of democracy is that the masses, the people, choose once every 4 or 5 or however many years between different elites. Those elites do not represent the electors. They're not responsible to the electors except in the sense of a post hoc judgment in the election. A very minimal conception of democracy. And that has been the one which I think has dominated much political science discussion, and certainly the one which is explicitly present in transitology. This has been modified to a certain extent since 1989, since the end of history. There's been a link between the processes of marketization and democratization. That democracy means markets, markets mean democracy, has been the dominant interpretation. And this should involve the emergence of media just like those in what are explicitly called the originator countries, Northwestern Europe and North America. Really, they mean the USA. And this is obviously inadequate to account for the evidence. We can explain failure in terms of local conditions, and people do explain the fact that civil society is underdeveloped, politicians are ill-educated, market is underdeveloped, journalists are ill-prepared. But these criticisms are present in country after country. People analysing Romania, people analysing Bulgaria, people analysing Russia, and so on and so forth, will come up with the same characteristics, which suggests that these are not specific to countries. They're general characteristics of a particular type of social experience. And surely after 20 years there should be some evidence of progress. And I think that we need a comparative account of the general conditions. If we look more widely, if we consider the fragments of the former Soviet Union, I've been talking now really up until about Eastern Europe, we cannot conclude there is a single pattern of change. The Baltic republics fit the Central European model fairly well. Some successor states, notably in Central Asia, never experienced a democratic moment at all. They went straight from being Communist Party dictatorships to being individual dictatorships. And in most cases, the communist dictator became the individual dictator, and he's succeeded by his son. Russia itself only approximated to democracy in the early 1990s and has since regressed. All of these states, to a lesser degree, have adopted market economics, greater or lesser degree, and there are clearly a wide range of possible outcomes in terms of political forms. If we look at China, that provides another route out of communism. We should remember that 1989 was not just a European phenomenon, not just the fall of the Berlin Wall, but also Tiananmen Square. China is different. It still is a dictatorship of the Communist Party. The Communist Party has the control of all major levers of power. It clearly has a highly marketized economy. The Chinese joke says that you don't realize how capitalist China is until you go to a socialist country like America. The newly created middle class does not seem to be very interested in democracy. They're more interested in Louis Vuitton than in political revolution. There is opposition, mass opposition, and it comes from workers and peasants. 50, 60, 70,000 mass actions a year. You know, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the kind of thing we're talking about. Some party bureaucrat in a big car runs over a peasant on a bicycle. The police come along and arrest the peasant for obstructing the highway. A crowd gathers. They attack the police car. More police arrive. A riot develops. The Communist Party headquarters is burned down. The riot police arrive. There's a 3-day battle. Order is restored. That's not the middle class fighting for democracy. That's workers and peasants fighting hard against a very oppressive system. And the media reflect this situation. They're almost completely commercial in business terms. There are still some subsidies, but overwhelmingly they are commercial media, and they are still subject to direct political control. According to transitology, there should be a clash between a market orientation and political control. There is no evidence for this. People have examined China in great detail for the last 20 years in order to try and demonstrate that this is the case, and they have not been able to demonstrate it. There have been the foundation of new media outlets, which have been able to the standard model of the party press group, having its party organ, People's Daily or Guanming Daily, and having a commercial medium which raises the money, which keeps the sclerotic party organ alive, and so forth. There's a division that has emerged in some cases: private ownership of technical functions, party ownership of editorial functions. There's a big debate over the status of journalists. Are they incorporated into the system as privileged members of the middle class, which is what He and Li, for example, and Huang Yu argue, or are they, in fact, always trying to push the red line, or are some of them trying to push the red line? Are they fighting a guerrilla war to establish professional standards? And do these professional standards simply derive from the fact they've read Newsweek, or are they also to do with an indigenous Confucian tradition about the role of intellectuals? I don't know the answer to that. And even critics of the system share much of its underlying ideology, notably the nationalism. How can this possibly be the case? Well, there is an interpenetration of the business and political elite. Capitalists are very warmly welcome in the Communist Party. The route to business success is often through politically sanctioned seizure of public assets. The key to continuing success is good political relations. Relations often means, literally, relations: your uncle, your cousin, your daughter, your son, and so on. And this process is very visible in the mass media. There's bribery of individual journalists. There's close relations between party and local businessmen. There are strong influence of large advertisers. And there's an increasing ownership of technical functions by large corporations. In the media themselves, we have this marriage between political control and business success. These are similar processes. When you tell Eastern Europeans about the processes that are taking place in China, they have instant recognition. This is what we could call political capitalism. Seizure of public assets for private gain is a common feature across both of these societies. The consequent endemic corruption, bribing politicians and so forth in order to retain your assets, is endemic in both systems. There are strong continuities between the old and the new elites. These are very marked in business and the state machine. When the communist parties fell in Central and Eastern Europe, the one or two policemen were kicked out, but most of them retained their jobs. Most of the generals, most of the university presidents, most of the editors of newspapers and so on retained their jobs. And of course in China there has been no significant, well, occasionally the mayor of Shanghai gets jailed for corruption or something, but no significant transformation of the elite. In Central and Eastern Europe, a less obvious continuity in political elites, but in fact still a surprisingly high degree of continuity. So I want to propose a different model of change. Transitology doesn't explain what has occurred. It saw markets and democracy as the twin ends of the process, and it is clearly wrong. There is no necessary link between markets and democracy. To sustain that view, you have to ignore the evidence. It's fine for religious people, but we're supposed to be social scientists. Elite continuity and renewal provides a much more robust theory. The idea that the nature of the process going on is that an elite which formerly ruled through its control of the party and state machine, fusing economics and politics, is transforming itself over a period of years into a classic capitalist class with a separation of business and politics, with a very strong continuity of its leadership and so on. And I think that that is a theory which explains fairly well both the examples of Schumpeterian democracy in the European Union, the vicious, brutal personal dictatorships in Central Asia, and the continuing communist dictatorship in China. Democracy is a contingent outcome. I wish it wasn't. I'm very much in favour of democracy. I'd like to have a great deal more democracy around the world, starting in Britain. But democracy is a contingent, and in the USA, it's a contingent outcome, not the defining characteristic of the process. A command economy can change itself into a market economy without a political revolution. When a decade ago I wrote a book about Eastern Europe, I ended up by saying this is the only road. You've got to have a political revolution in order to establish a market economy. You have to get rid of the Communist Party. I was obviously wrong. China proves that I was completely and utterly wrong. You can move from a command economy to what is substantially a market economy without any major political upheaval. And there is no necessary connection between marketization and democratization. So what should we be doing next in the Chinese context? Well, the major comparative instrument at the moment is that provided by Helen and Mancini. I'm sure you're all familiar with this book, so I won't bother to tell you what they say. They operate, as you know, with a functionalist model derived, I guess, mostly from Talcott Parsons, and there is a problem with that model, I think. It fits China quite well. Very clear example, that the self-conscious role of the Chinese Communist Party is to sustain the reproduction of the existing social system. And functionalist model fits that rather well. Functionalist models fit Eastern Europe much less well because we've experienced a rupture, a break, a sharp change in the nature of the mass media. So I think that functionalist models historically, it's a standard 1960s criticism of Talcott Parsons. There's a limited ability to account for change. We need a robust comparative model. I think that one of the shortcomings of Helen and Mancini is that it's over-politicized. They talk about the relationship between party, politics and journalism, between media and state machine and so on. And I think that has a very poor fit with the realities of the mass media. If you take the BBC, say, maybe 10% of its output is to do with politics and social affairs. The other 90% is entertainment, education, and so on. If you take a standard newspaper, probably you'll find that it has more coverage of soccer than it does of politics, and so on. So there's a lack of fit. If you want to account for politics and the media, that's fine. But if you want to talk about the relationship between media and the social system, then you have to account for the other 90% of the mass media. And I think in China that's acutely the case, that we tend to talk, even when we talk about, let's say, Hunan TV and its very popular shows, we tend to ask, what are the political implications of voting for Supergirl or whatever? Yeah? We don't ask, what is this as a cultural phenomenon? If you go to any Chinese newsstand, what you will find, very clearly and very obviously, is a vast range of magazines, many of which are familiar from Los Angeles. AL, Cosmopolitan, FHM, and so on. Not a single serious study of these. Well, there are one or two beginning to be studies of these. They've been much neglected in favour of comparative analysis of the New York Times and People's Daily's coverage of the Iraq invasion or whatever. An over-politicised account of Chinese media. And I think that the role of these media have been crucial in the making of this new middle class. The shift, if you like, to, sort of from comrades to consumers, from waving a red Mao book to waving a Louis Vuitton bag, is actually one of the main, striking, obvious things that hits you in the face when you walk down the Nanjing Road. Or for that matter, when you are on the tube in Beijing. That this transformation of this creation of a class of consumers who may be not the majority of the population for sure, but 100 million, 200 million, 300 million people. Their identity has been formed over the last 20 or 30 years, partly at least by these consumer-oriented mass media, by the TV shows, by the magazines, by the supplements to the newspapers, and so on. And this seems to me to be a major neglected area of study. Rather curious that someone like me, a hardcore political economist with a tradition of writing about political news should say this, but, I suppose I'm pretty good at saying I've been wrong. The fact is that, that this seems to me to be a matter of central importance in understanding contemporary China. In the case of media and journalists, I find myself in strong agreement with Lu Yu. We need to abandon the idea of unitary control. That there is a limited degree of fragmentation of political power. Only a limited degree, but nevertheless it exists. Newspapers in different cities, say, have different kinds of content. Everybody knows, newspapers in Guangzhou operate in a much more liberal climate than newspapers in Shanghai. There's a limited degree of conflict between different media outlets, very limited. But again, you talk to any journalist in Shanghai, and the thing they really hate, any TV journalist in Shanghai, the thing they really, really, really hate is not the Communist Party, not the local party leadership, not their low salaries. What they really, really, really hate is CCTV. That's the enemy. They're the people who are coming and stealing their footage. They're the people who are allowed to cover the stories they can't cover, and so on. So it's a limited degree of conflict. I don't want to overstress the degree of conflict, but clearly thinking of China in terms of the classic totalitarian model of unified control is false. There's a need to abandon the search for common traits of professionalism. I think that possibly in the USA, this makes sense, to speak of journalists as having a common set of values, a common set of news values, a common set of professional criteria. Doesn't make sense in many countries, doesn't make any sense at all in Britain. The news values used by the journalists on The Sun are different from those used on the Financial Times. Simple fact which we could demonstrate endlessly and easily. We need to think of journalism and journalists as a group which undergoes conflicting pressures and whose ideas and ideologies are modified by those conflicting pressures. What are the lines within journalism? Not just the line between journalists and the Central Propaganda Department or the Provincial Propaganda Department, but the lines of division within journalism. Are these lines of division between party and non-party journalists? I don't think so. I think there are much more subtle social pressures operating. I think we need to look also at the issue of external influence. Traditionally, one looks at external influence. I think the phrase was, the wolves are coming. Rupert is going to come and gobble up Chinese media. He's going to, take over key media. He's going to turn it all into a model of a copy of Fox and so on. I think we need to certainly think about the ways in which China has resisted and accommodated outside pressures. But I think we have to see the issue of China as increasingly as an actor rather than as a victim. So in my conclusions would be, and nobody's stopped me yet, someone must be not looking at their watch closely enough, because I've been going for more than 10 minutes. First of all, the main lesson from Eastern European is that of elite continuity. Yes, there were great political revolutions. Yes, the communist monolith was swept away, but the same people run the societies. There are exceptions. There are individual examples of renewal, but actually, in reality, the main institutions of society, including the mass media, remain the same, both in terms of individuals and in terms of institutions. And that's particularly marked in the mass media. And that's very strongly marked in China. CCTV is still the dominant broadcaster in China. It's got challenges, it's true, and one of the cultural questions we might like to explore when we're looking at cultural questions is the character of the challenge to CCTV, which isn't really about news, it's about entertainment programming. I think we need to abandon completely the transistological model, this idea that we're moving towards a known end, that we have a teleological theory of what will happen in China, is not sustainable. We need to abandon it. I think we need to refocus studies of media away from over-politicization. By this, I do not mean that we should neglect politics, that we should neglect, obviously, the central relationship between media and politics. Indeed, given the centrality of political capitalism in China, politics are likely to be much, much more important in China than they are in the USA, where politics is relatively restricted in its influence on everyday life. In China, it's clearly much sharper and much greater. So yes, we need to continue to analyze those political changes, but we should not any longer exclusively concentrate on them. I think we have to look towards the cultural functions of the media more and more. I think we need to look more at the complexity of the exercise of power over the media. And I think we need to look more at the contradictory process of journalism, rather than trying to find out whether Chinese journalists are really adopting a model of professionalism, where I think we need to say that we would expect to find, our hypothesis will be, that there will be contradictory and conflicting notions of what to be a journalist means in China. Some people will still see themselves as throats and tongues. Some people will want to be Bernstein and Woodward. And there will be a whole range of different positions present amongst the journalistic cadre. And we need to move towards seeing China as an international actor, as increasingly a country whose power, economic power, will be translated into cultural power. This is, what happens. The world plays soccer. We call it, the rest of the world calls it football, but I say soccer here for obvious reasons. Because in the 19th century, Britain was the largest, most powerful, militarily and economically, force in the world. The world watches Hollywood movies because when the cinema was being formed in the 20th century, America was the largest and most powerful economic and political force in the world. There is a strong possibility, not a certainty, but a possibility, that China will be in the 21st century the strongest and most powerful military and political force in the world. And we would therefore expect its cultural influence, this horrible phrase, soft power, its cultural influence to expand along with that economic and military influence. So I think we need to see China less and less in terms of a victim of foreign predators in the cultural sphere, and more as a country which is emerging as an actor. More and more as a country which is changing its IPR regime in order to allow its new players to export. More and more debating the cultural implications of making products that can sell on the world market and so on. Okay, I think that's all I want to say. Let me thank you for listening. Let me thank the timekeeper for not doing so, and I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great privilege to be here at this August gathering and to follow on from my distinguished colleague, Colin Sparks. I wanted to thank, first of all, first anything else, Dean Wilson for inviting me. I'm not a China expert by any stretch of imagination, although my the name tag had, for some reason, my surname was at Liang, L-I-A-N-G. They had to strike out afterwards. They must have thought, how could somebody who's not Chinese be interested in China? I am interested in global communication, and I'm interested in how what's happening in China is going to impact on global communication. But I'm from India, and I'm also interested in what's happening in that country. So my paper is really about this new phenomena called Chindia and global communication. The paper is actually available on the website of this forum. In the 9.5 minutes I have left, I'll try to summarize some of the key points. And also try to answer those 4 questions we were asked to think about. I broadly agree with my colleague about the quality of research on media and communication in China, although with a qualification that is relatively recent phenomena. It was only in 1980s and 1990s that they started thinking about communication and media studies as a field. So let's not be too hasty. And I also want to talk about two things that we need to do to actually take what's happening in China seriously, incorporate that into the teaching and syllabi of communication courses. Now, traditionally, as we all know, there has been a dominance and dependency syndrome in terms of how communication has been taught across the globe. It's largely an American model of communication studies, which has been adopted across the world. And it was hugely influenced by the logic of the Cold War. The ideas associated with modernization thesis was quite dominant in much of the global South, particularly. But since the end of the Cold War, there has been a debate going on, particularly in the Western world, about the limitations of that discourse. Questions about internationalizing media theory and more recently of de-Westernizing media studies have been taken up. In fact, I've been involved in that debate. One of the paper which was circulated for this symposium was by my distinguished colleague Yishi Zhao about the Chinese media studies, and it was published in a book that I edited called Internationalizing Media Studies, which was published earlier this year. So internationalization of communication media studies is very important, and in that China has a very, very important role to play, primarily because of the economic rise of China. But it also has an implication of what's happening in other parts of Asia, particularly in India. And I want to talk about this phenomena called Chindia and how that might influence what we think about how we think about communication. Now, how many of you have heard this phrase, Chindia? Okay, quite a lot of you. But if you do a Google search, you'll find 145,000 hits. There are at least 6 full-length books on this subject. In fact, the term was coined by Jairam Ramesh, who is the Environment Minister of India. You will see him on television, I think, tonight or tomorrow, because the Indians and the Chinese and the rest of the developing world is, contesting the Western discourse on environment. He's a very good-looking man and a very articulate man too. It's something which is It's something which is actually happened. It's not just a made-up word. It's not just a neologism. It's actually happened. It's one of those untold stories of globalization outside the media spotlight. At the beginning of 1990s, there was no trade between China and India. In 2008, it was in the range of $40 billion. So China is India's largest trading partner. In terms of communication studies, both these countries are having nothing short of a revolution. China has something in the range of 700 departments with communication as a major subject. In India, it's mushrooming like anything. There's also a massive growth within the industry, both in India and China. China is now the largest, has the largest blogging population in the world. When in terms of total population, it's a very small amount. As we heard earlier, about 25% of the Chinese are online. But in terms of total blogging population, it's the largest in the world. It's also the largest exporter of IT products in the world. India has the largest number of news networks anywhere on the globe. Now 70, soon to touch 3 figures. We have 100 dedicated news channels. And what is more, most of them are actually making money. Newspapers both in China and India are doing extremely well, unlike in this part of the world. And with the this Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers now agreeing that they are going to allow traffic on the cyberspace in other languages, just the Latin ones, the languages like Mandarin, we're going to be inundated by Chinese internet. So it's changing very, very rapidly. Now, what should be done about it? I think, given the time constraints, I just want to talk about 2 points in terms of what should be done. First is to look more carefully about what we teach in communication studies, not just in the West or in China or India, but globally. That there are actually interesting linkages between communication that goes back to centuries, not just invention of newspapers. If we had that kind of global communication history, we'll realize that actually printing was invented in China, not in Germany, that there were universities in what is today Pakistan, Takshashila, the ruins still exist there. It was 3rd century BC. That there was huge communication between various countries in Asia and rest of the world. So bring theory into the discourse, bring theory into the syllabi, bring theory into research. History into research. That's the one thing I want to say. The second point I want to make, which is very relevant in the context of Chindia especially, is that despite what we read about these 2 major countries with massive economic growth and huge populations and all the kinds of things that business pages are full of, they're also home to the world's largest number of poor people. And even if they grow at the rate they're growing now, and it'll take them a long time to catch up to the kind of standard of living people are used to in Western Europe or in this part of the world. So there is a lot that needs to be done in terms of how you use communication and media to actually empower and develop societies. The whole discourse about development communication, which has its roots in this kind of Cold War modernization theory, needs rethinking. That is a huge intellectual project. And I'm very pleased to say that actually discussion has already started on these kinds of things, both in India and I'm sure in China too. Monroe Prize here was very kind to organize a pre-conference at the ICA in Chicago last year on India and communication studies, and we heard some really interesting papers, very indigenously, kind of developed ideas about what can be done to push the envelope, as it were. So the bigger challenge is really how can we think of China or Chindia in a global context when we don't take these places as examples, that we have the theory and these places are examples. The challenge is that we have the theory and then, US or America, or UK or Europe is the example. So theory is coming from somewhere else. Now that's a long-term project, and I'm sure for us today and tomorrow we'll find some ideas about how we can think about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, am I coming through here? I too want to echo the gratitude others have expressed for the invitation to this conference, and also echo the admiration for the organizers. It's really a marvelous gathering, and I'm very honored to be here. I'm curious about who's twittering. I'm not a big twitterer, but I see we have a Twitter feed going, and so if this can be summarized in 140 characters, that's great. I'll try to be brief. We have a collection of really interesting papers, some very formal research papers, others essays on the website, and Colin Sparks' presentation was based on a much longer paper, of course. I think he has a great deal to say, and before I go into my own remarks, I just want to make the point that there's a very famous political theorist who was tremendously concerned about the dangers of self-perpetuating elites in so-called revolutionary societies. It occurs to me that Colin Sparks is a Maoist.
That's fighting talk. I am not and never have been.
Go back and read some of that stuff. Go back and read Chairman Mao. I mean, this is what he predicted would happen. This is what the Cultural Revolution was all about. Anyway, I could not resist this. I'm sorry. No epithet intended. I'll get to Dean Wilson's questions at the end, but my essay is very short. I was asked to write 10 pages, and I could only type with one hand at the time, so I wrote 5. But my view is that the study of mass media and communication and many surrounding and intersecting processes and contexts has gone from pretty much nowhere to much more than somewhere. I think that we've come a tremendous way in the past 3 decades, particularly since the late 80s, past 2 decades. I think that we started out with a very small core of militaristically Cold War tracts on mass communication in China that accepted the premise of a totalitarian society. And while China used to be much more totalistically managed, it never was a totalistic society. It never was a monolith. And some of the most perceptive research in Chinese area studies quite early on began to remedy that vision. All these papers point out significant gaps in our knowledge and in our research and in our attentions, places that really require more thought, new approaches. On the other hand, I do think there actually are a lot of people working to fill those gaps, not necessarily in a deliberative, coherent way, but given the numbers of Chinese graduate students, not only in communication programs, but in political science, sociology, history, art history, literature, there's a great deal of work going on in our field among young scholars and also among more established scholars that is that illuminates communication and media a great deal, and I don't think that we mine that literature enough. And in my essay, I make the point that communication scholars have always begged, borrowed, and stolen from everybody else, and we should keep doing this because there's tremendously important work out there that can be useful to us. And I actually think, for instance, that issues of popular culture in China are being addressed in many, many realms, and that work is well underway. I think that a lot of the most interesting and promising work avails itself of the much longer track record of serious, complex, grounded studies in other fields and disciplines, and we need to do more of that. I also pay a little bit of homage to C. Wright Mills's The Sociological Imagination and his call to meld understanding of the individual and the structural, the biographical and the historical. And again, I think a lot of the most interesting work in our field tries to do that, tries to bridge the divide rather than focusing on grounded daily life experience alone or on focusing on macroscopic theory building. The most interesting work tries to make connections between the two. To me, really, the most disturbing trends in the study of mass communication, media, and so forth in China, popular culture, really have to do not with the subject matter and the approaches, but with the nature of the academy itself. I have a sense that scholarship in China, which is increasingly important, I mean, I think it's critical that scholars within China whether they be trained abroad or trained in China, be trying to uncover layers of meaning within their own societies. But they are increasingly driven by the same sort of publish or perish pressures and research funding pressures that we in the West are under, and I think this injects tremendous distortions into research. I mean, it influences where we go, what we do, what we study, and it's unfortunate. And I think there are certain trends that we probably should talk more about and perhaps resist. Okay, Dean Wilson's questions. In your area of expertise, how much attention is being paid? I guess my area of expertise is mainly production of media in China. I'm interested in how things get out there, who makes them, how they're made, the structures and organizations and people that produce content. It's increasing. It's never enough, but I think there is attention being paid. Quality of research, I wouldn't call it high, medium, or low. I would call it mixed. I would say there's excellent research and there's abominable research. The two most important and interesting questions of research that need more attention, I wouldn't phrase these in terms of questions. I would phrase it in terms of reaching across disciplines. Again, really looking into what scholars of China in other fields have been doing that either touch on or bear directly on communication, and I believe there's a lot. Are there distinctive Eastern or Western, Chinese or Western approaches or views of communication? There are distinctive approaches that are shaped by context. There are not inherently distinctive approaches. That's my view. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
I submitted my so-called thought piece with the title Articulation and Rearticulation, Agendas for Understanding Media and Communication in China, which is obviously doesn't fit this session. The title of this session is Chinese Communication in a World Historical Context, Continuities and Ruptures. It seems to me that we are dealing with the kind of difficulty that Michel Foucault dealt with potentially. He was arguing against the linear model of progression toward something as if predestined in human development. And by arguing against that, he actually emphasized a lot more on the discontinuities and ruptures. So this word rupture sort of brought to mind Michel Foucault. Now, of course, I'm not here to talk about Michel Foucault, given how little I know about him. I just could not resist the temptation of making a couple of quick comments on my esteemed senior colleague, Professor Colin Sparks' presentation. Number one, of course, who are those theorists who actually automatically assume marketization would bring in democratization? If there are those out there who make that assumptions, then let's stop reading their work.
I'll send you a reading.
And the second thing, of course, in China, it seems indeed the changes in China have taken place and seem to suggest that communist regime change is not a prerequisite of the development of market economy. But who says that Chinese communist regime has not changed? Chinese Communist Party today is the Communist Party 30 years ago? Is it still a Communist Party other than the name, other than its discourse when articulating, advancing its policies? I think that's an open question. And why are we comparing China with East European countries? Because simply that we were all once communist countries, but the Chinese as communist regime and the East European communist regimes, they were formed historically in very different paths, in very different contexts. I think that kind of comparisons probably are somewhat problematic. Indeed, I agree that we need to abandon the search, futile search, for common traits of journalistic professionalism. But who are doing that? Who is searching for the common traits of journalistic professionalism? To me, I think Professor Liu and I have written a couple of pieces on this topic, and we sort of treat journalistic professionalism as a system of occupational discourse, as a kind of resource for journalists operating in a specific context to resist at times the erosion of the market forces and to counter the political control at other times. So we have never been searching for some kind of common traits between Tom Brokaw and Bai Yansong. So those are just my quick remarks. And those remarks actually reflect sort of my view. I think it is somewhat dangerous for us to talk about research on China's media and communication without a sort of a spatially, historically, culturally grounded location, the context. A vantage point. And it seems to me a lot of times people are talking about the research in a transnational perspective. They are basically taking extraterrestrial vantage point. I don't know where they are located. That's a fundamental problem to me. So my research is much more modest. I have been doing research on the problems in China with full recognition that what I'm doing is nothing more than a case study. With full recognition that all those studies conducted in other countries, the Eastern European countries or the United States, even though they are formulated in the universalistic terms, they're nothing more than representations from case studies. And oftentimes just specifically construed cases. At the same time, such problems of China problems in China, given China's increasing submission or immersion in the global system, they are intertwined with the problems of globalization. For example, the problems of media commercialization, the spread of the consumerist values, the increasing social inequality among segments of the population and among different regions in China, and so on. and the absence of representation, and this is the key issue that I'm particularly interested in examining further, the complete absence, or almost complete absence, of representation and articulation of public interest, not something that is dictated by the political regime, the power, and so on, clearly are tied to the expansion of the global economic forces in China and are simultaneously part of the fundamental injustice of the present global order. And this is an order that was evolved from the history of colonial exploitation by the West. Let's never forget that one. Now, despite this recognition, I still insist upon more sort of grounded research in China on the problems of China and in China, because this particular vantage point compels us to frame research questions about China's media and communication quite differently. And this particular framing of the research problematics, central problematics, is more rooted or grounded in China's local context and more sort of instigated by the imperatives in China's historical and social formation. It also potentially highlights the tensions and dynamics in China's context before they are characterized or categorized by some general theories, which are not based upon nothing more than just case studies in some other countries, in a non-Chinese context, or in the context of Chinese, in the context of the other. In essence, this is a more bottom-up, more inductive, more local, and more micro research. So in other words, before we talk about China's role in the world, or the China problems, or the China as international player, now let's understand China first. Now, I'm not going into the specific details. I simply, in my thought piece, I suggested that appropriating the cultural studies concept articulation, which basically refers to this uneasy and problematic tension field joining of different forces, to talk about three different areas of research that I'm interested in, and I think we should all examine. And before I talk about that, I also want to just be nasty, say that my remarks up to this point basically suggest that we need to be very wary of the potential double, I love this word, even though I don't know how to how to explain it, double endogeneity. Some econometrician would love this. Double endogeneity of a cybernetic loop between discourses of the media, official policymaking, and the elites. And basically what I'm saying is that what we are studying very often is produced, constructed by those in the local context. And we take that as evidence of objective reality. There's one endogeneity right there. And oftentimes when we talk about our research and report our research, we frame the research and supply certain theoretical concepts or even names of those famous scholars, using them as a sort of badge of honor, as what Pierre Bourdieu would say, the symbolic capital that we wear. But unfortunately, such discourse gets fed back to the Chinese context and will be used as discursive resources to influence or change the object that we're studying. That's what I meant by double endogeneity. And that's the problem that we need to pay particular attention to. Now, three different areas of research with this notion broadened conception of articulation. Basically, one is we really need to think about the institutional formation, institutional change in China, and of course that includes media institution, but certainly is not limited to the media institution. These institutional formation, institutional change involves introducing the market economy, market mechanisms. But the marriage between the market economy and the principles of market economy as we know it in this country and the so-called communist political system in China is, of course, never easy and is, of course, always involves this kind of local adaptations, localizations. And this is the part, I think, we need to examine greatly. And when we talk about localization, local adaptations, and we have to examine the social actors and sometimes political actors in a specific context who act very creatively to utilize different resources from different ideological discursive systems to create new situations. So that's one. And second, we really need to examine the media representations that are embedded in the logic and forces of the institutional formation and change, but also provide a certain, what I call a discursive toolkit for the actual social actors, for the broader social and cultural formation. There are many topics to examine, but for me, I'm particularly interested in the following issues in the media representations. And basically, the other representations that blend symbolic tools or resources from all different sources to privilege the Communist Party's present constituents. The present constituents are not workers, peasants any longer. The urban middle class, the professionals, the bureaucrats. And so very different constituents. And suborganizers, their traditional constituents, the workers, peasants. Right? And that's something it is particularly interesting to study. And such media presentations privilege and even glorify the social roles of consumers, but neglect the social roles of citizens. That's interesting to study. And such representations are also privileged and naturalize the ethnocentric Han people's vision of Chinese nation and the political representation of this particular nation by the current regime. In other words, I am saying that the representation of very ethnocentric model of Chinese nationalism is worth studying. And the third area of research utilizing this notion of articulation is really to examine how the social cultural formation unfolds in people's everyday life, and in what ways media and the forces that they embody, the media embody, are implicated. Here the interesting questions include how people actually use the media to organize their daily life, how they use the media to manage their relationships, the relationship between, say, a middle-class head of the household and his or her maid, right? And how they use the media as resources to operate as consumers, citizens, men, women, parents, daughters, and sons, and so on. How they actually configure the media in their immediate social-cultural eco-environment. Fundamentally, we need to have a better understanding how the media may be functioning as a communicative infrastructure and resources with material underpinnings and consequences. So that would be the third area of research. And my sort of quick response to Dean Wilson's 4 questions is that first, the answer is very little research has been paid to the area of my expertise or specialty, and one of the reasons is because I don't know what that is. And second, the quality of scholarship. Well, I actually found that scholarship on China's media and communication has reasonably good, high quality. but in terms of the scholarship produced by some are present over here, and the scholarship produced by my colleagues in China who, because of the language barrier, are unable to present their observations, insights in English. That by itself says something about the inequality, injustice in the global order, of course. What are the 2 or 3 the most interesting research questions? Well, I just mentioned 3. And different models, I concur completely with my friend Judy Polumbaum. There is no inherent American model or Eastern model, European model or Chinese model. And there shouldn't be. I hope that we will proceed with that assumption as well. Thank you.
We will now open up the room for questions. If anyone has any questions they want to ask any of the panel members. Well, I have a question I'll ask them. What I've heard across from all of you is that there is that in terms of studies of media and communications in China, that there needs to be a move, as Professor Polumbaum states in her paper, away from kind of the media political equation. And what I've sensed from most of your arguments that it needs to be a move to a more so a media kind of cultural equation, maybe a kind of a move and shift to cultural studies analysis as well as kind of studies of the political economy of culture. So I'm wondering, based off of your research as well as others whom you work with, what are some research tools as well as theoretical tools which might be helpful in doing such work?
Well, number one, of course, for non-Chinese is language. And that's something that has to begin very early among our students. And so increasingly as the years go by and I find myself wondering, why am I still doing this stuff when there are so many more people doing it better? My attention turns to undergraduates and getting them engaged with China and getting them interested in language. And to me, that is absolutely critical. Presumably it works the other way too, but again, we don't want to perpetuate this injustice. One of the really enjoyable things about doing fieldwork in China quite early, I did my dissertation research in 87, 88, was that I was sort of serving vicariously as a tool for my Chinese colleagues. I, the stupid American bumbling about, was asking questions that they couldn't ask and getting away with it. And, they were facilitating my work because not only were they being kind and wonderful to me, but they were very interested in what I'd come up with. And, as some of the strictures fall away and as increasingly native-born Chinese come out, are educated abroad, go back to China and do research, I feel, as not a native speaker, my position is increasingly, my role is increasingly doing other things. But the more young people we can get learning about China and engaging with China early on, the better. So for me, that's really the starting point. But there's a lot more.
You see, the word culture itself is complicated. Raymond Williams, the famous Cambridge scholar, once said that culture was the most difficult word in English language. So when you say cultural studies, much of the theoretical framework is actually that has emerged from a particular cultural context. As you know, cultural studies mostly emerged from the UK, and it has a very kind of Eurocentric stamp on it. And if we are trying to understand cultures of journalism, for example, in China or in some other context, I think we need to understand the culture in a little more detail, and that would then lead to what I was saying earlier about history, that the basic understanding of how the culture has evolved One of the problems with our discipline is that we are too often sort of very media-centric or very communication-centric. And one of the, as Judy also said, one of the key things is to actually go beyond one's discipline and talk to historians and cultural historians, particularly if you want to understand what's happening in the Chinese context or any other context for that matter. Thank you.
I just wanted to piggyback on one thing Judy said, which I think was great. In Chinese studies, though, trying to learn about communication from another field, a lot of what I read is in communication studies, but a lot is in other disciplines. And ironically, actually, two of you are from University of Westminster, and one of the best things for putting Chinese media communication into something of a historical context is Picturing Power in the People's Republic of China, which came out of the University of Westminster's Chinese Cultural Revolution poster collection, and was an interdisciplinary volume with art historians, people in different disciplines, political science, history, and also, and this was what I wanted to bring in, a journalist, John Giddings, wrote a chapter for it. And I think one special thing in the China field, maybe especially now, is a lot of the most interesting thinking is going on by what might be called freelance intellectuals, some of whom are journalists, some of whom are bloggers. I read people like Kaiser Kuo, Rebecca McKinnon, who's former CNN and now at the China Media Project in Hong Kong. These are all, so I think it's actually even beyond the academy.
Well, look also Jim Fallows, Evan Osnos, some of the most interesting.
And actually one of your alums, Pallavi Iyer, is writing very insightfully about moving with Indian eyes, looking at China, including at its media structures. And now recently she's moved to Europe and is now moving between those three places. And I think very skillfully showing the problem with any kind of notion of solid categories of East-West and so forth. So I think that's I think it's hard sometimes for us academics. I'm a historian and I sort of see tension with popular history. But I think at certain moments you have to be open to what's going on, especially with a media system changing so quickly. People that aren't academics per se, but are really very thoughtful journalists in the field who are actually doing some what we would call theoretical work, but they don't write about it the same way.
And can you please identify who you are so we...
Oh, sorry. Jeff Wasserstruck, University of California, Irvine.
Fantastic.
Jeff is one of the editors. Is this on? Jeff's one of the editors of this great blog called The China Beat, which if you haven't looked at, you should.
Monroe Price. Microphone. Okay, well, okay. Thanks. I wanted to ask this, maybe particularly of Colin, but maybe everyone, and that is contrasting the 90s and the sort of alteration or transformation of media in Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, and a kind of professionalization of discourse between Western Europe and the United States and Russia and Eastern Europe, and then a kind of replication of that, perhaps in this decade and perhaps in this conference. That is to say, the professionalization of a kind of discourse on communication studies between China and the United States. So my question is, what are the differences and what are the similarities between these two discourses, and what do we suppress or repress about the weaknesses of that discourse that may emerge in this one?
I think that the sharp edge of the relationship between media discourses evolved primarily in the USA, but also in some other European countries, and in some other European countries, is in journalism training. That in the 90s there was a steady flow of missionaries from Mississippi and Columbia and the BBC World Service Trust and so on, who went to Eastern Europe, and young Eastern European journalists came to University of Columbia or Mississippi, or probably here to Annenberg as well, and learnt how to be good American journalists. And they, all learnt about distinction between fact and value. They all learnt about the need to confirm sources from at least 2 or 3 outlets. They all learnt about the fact that, that journalists should be, critical of all forms of political and economic power and so on. They all learnt, they all read about Bernstein and Woodward and so on. And they went back to Poland or Romania or Russia, and they reproduced, with only minor variations, the dominant norms of local journalism. Now, there's one reason for that is that there is a distinctive European model of journalism which is different from the American journalism. In American journalism, the reporter is the star. In European journalism, the commentator is the star. You'll be surprised to learn that Habermas is a well-known commentator in the German press, for example, which is an interesting thought. So I think there was a sense in which the American model wasn't really appropriate in European terms. But there's also reality is that that training journalists is one thing, but these journalists have to get jobs and they have to keep jobs, and that means they are subordinated to the demands and needs and drives of the.
My question is whether we're replicating that.
Well, let me get to it. Yeah, and I think that that's certainly what is happening now with China. I mean, I teach Westminster. There's an MA in international journalism. I mean, it's mostly how to write stories, but because it's an MA, they have to have a little bit of theory. So I teach a little bit of theory, and we have long discussions about the different models of journalism. We have long discussions about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We have long discussions about the position of women in the media and so on. And the Chinese students and the African students and the Middle Eastern students all produce very, very good essays full of, sort of all the right sources saying, sort of human rights absolutely central to the task of journalism, blah, 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 blah. And then they go back and get perfectly good jobs with the Shanghai Media Group and perfectly good jobs with newspapers in China. And so I think, that we have to, we have to be, be sensible about this. We outside don't have much effect. That if there is going to be change in China, it will primarily be driven by the Chinese. And I think that the missionary coming from a journalism school in the West and preaching. I was at a conference in Wuhan the other day, and someone from a Western institution came, and they were just so revoltingly patronising. We know the answers. We're going to tell you. We're going to help you. If I was Chinese, I would have thrown things at them. That I think that there's, that Western scholars, and I'm taking the journalism example because that's the clearest example of the missionary position, and it simply doesn't work. I mean, that from Iraq, it didn't work. That you cannot transplant the norms of the New York Times, the norms of the British Broadcasting Corporation to, what one could call an alien environment. That the growth of new media forms depends upon the changes in economic, political, and social cultures in different countries. So, and I think that's the sharp end of something that we all have to be acutely aware of. Particularly someone like me who's very fond of preaching. I have to be very remember that that dialogue rather than preaching is more effective, I would say.
I have some Jack Chiu from Chinese University of Hong Kong to bring I have some comments to bring our discussion back to the global context. I think so far we've been talking too much about the world as a one-dimensional differentiating between the East and the West. However, starting from Zhao's talk, and especially in her thought piece, closer to the end when she was talking about the new theories in the world system, theorists, like Andrew Frank and also Giovanni Arrighi. using China as a center to rethink about global South. So that's Daya used that term, and I think when Colin was talking about elite continuity, okay, it's also a way to address the differences. Okay, not in terms of the East-West, is essentially a cultural a centralized way of Confucianism versus Christianity, whereas there are and when Pan was talking about the different nationalities within China, right? So there are all these. The world is also north and south. So I just want to bring out tomorrow I will talk more about the specific in my area of interest. But in a global context, if we can think about the function, the contribution of communication and media studies, and how can it be different from if we think about communication and journalism education in the past century, it has been very much elite-oriented, global north-oriented. So if we can think about, imagine, this move towards China, okay, both geopolitically and media culturally speaking, as also a chance to move towards a genuinely different 21st century communication media studies that's oriented, using China and India and Latin America and Africa and the environmental movements as the opportunity to reorient communication study towards these fundamental, problems of human society for existence, not for consumption. And I think that would be probably the greatest aspiration for Chinese communication scholars, broadly defined.
Yes, except that I mean, first of all, issues of consumption are still of central importance for millions and millions of people in the world. Clean water is not available to about a quarter of the world's population. And that's an issue of consumption which we need to address. The second thing I'd say is that although it's absolutely true, as Daya put it, that the largest reservoirs of human misery in the world are first of all in India, then in China, then in Africa and Latin America, it's not the case that the world is easily divided into global north and global south, that the elites in the global north can have much more in common with elites in the global south than either group has with their own populations. I'll give you an anecdotal example of that. Towards the end of the struggle against apartheid, there were negotiations between, it's called the British Commonwealth, it's a curious organisation, and the South African government. And part of these were military negotiations, yeah? So the Commonwealth sent a group of generals from Nigeria, all of them black, yeah, of course, and they met the South African generals, all of them white, all of them Afrikaners. And you'd think, there'd be a huge conflict. But actually they got on wonderfully well together because, they were... They both like killing people. They both like drinking a lot. They both like giving orders. They both, they were generals. Yeah, one group was white, one group was black, but they had an enormous number of things in common. So I think that think that very often the global elite, although it's clearly rooted in particular countries, nevertheless shares certain common interests across those national borders. And that my personal view is that I think again here I agree with Daya that one of the key tasks facing communication theory is to try and find ways of developing and empowering the poor of the to use a phrase, the wretched of the earth, to overcome the very real problems that they face, which are existential. Yeah, they are. People do starve to death. People do die of diseases, preventable diseases carried by water and so forth. So I think that's one of our key tasks.
Just a few words to add to that. The juncture in which we are discussing this is actually very interesting because in the Danish capital they're talking about the future of this planet And one of the phrases which has been bandied about is sustainable consumption. It used to be sustainable development. Now it is sustainable consumption. And one thing which really excites me as somebody who did international relations for a PhD, not communication, is that the Chinese model of capitalism, which has a certain, of course it's going through consumerism, excessive consumerism at the moment, but I have a sense from my reading of Asian history is that, there is a tradition of thrift and recycling and, saving, both in India and China. And I think in this world where we have very limited resources and very rapidly depleting resources, I think we need to think of a different model of capitalism. And perhaps China there has something interesting to offer. Because we get obsessed with the kind of censorship issues and, the UN Charter and Amnesty International. And China is much older than that and much more complex than that. And I think what is happening in China in terms of its economic development, it might be a potential to think of a new kind of capitalism, particularly relevant, not only in relation to what's happening in Denmark, but also what's happening to Western capitalism. I mean, we're living in a state which is, this particular state, which is bankrupt.
In relation to what Colin Sparks was saying, and this I'm sure will come up again and again, but I want to make sure I understand exactly where you're coming from. In part of what you were saying, you were talking about kind of an implied, or maybe not so implied, criticism of the comparative approach of China and Eastern Europe by saying we don't really know yet enough about China. And until we do that, with all of these case studies and bottom-up case studies, we're not ready to go further in terms of building any kind of general theories or even making broad generalizations across communist systems or any other kind of comparison that you might want to come up with. So I'm wondering whether you think that we should just look at China as a kind of unique entity and study China and not be concerned so much with grand theories of communication or even mid-range theories of communication. I wasn't sure if that was the debate between the two of you. And I know it's right in time for the coffee break pretty soon. So, I'm sure this will come up again, though, I think.
It's all, in all abstraction, comes at a cost. Any meta-discourse, even the most, the thickest anthropological account of reality, is a meta-discourse which sacrifices huge amount. And one of the classical critiques of from a professor in California of anthropology is precisely that that it is a meta-discourse. It's a writing about a culture. So I fully accept this criticism. Yes, that there are limitations to comparative studies. There are limitations to the best comparative studies. You look at Hallam Mancini, I can take you through that and show you 20 simple mistakes. I'm sure that if anyone reads anything I ever write on China, they're going to find more than 20 simple mistakes, because I don't speak Chinese. I'm not an expert on China, and that I'd be glad to be corrected. Yes, of course, that's present. That's necessarily present in any comparative model. But someone has to try. We have to take the risk. And if Pan Zhongdang wants to shoot down what I've said, say, look, you're empirically wrong about, I don't know, the differences between the kinds of subjects covered in the Nanfang Dushibao, as it called, and the kinds of subjects covered in People's Daily, then fine, okay, we'll have to rethink. But someone's got to take the risk, otherwise we will infinitely regress. And people will infinitely say, "Oh, you're not quite close enough to reality,"
I certainly admire people who would take risk of doing comparative research, and I would, for one, advocate very serious systematic comparative research. So my sort of criticism here is not so much whether we should or should not compare China with Eastern European countries. I am simply saying there is another side. When we are making that kind of argument, placing China in that kind of analytical context, we have already framed China, the subject matter, the object that we're studying. And we have already framed a particular question, the research question, in a particular way. That is, how does China step out of communism, enter into the post-communist world, right? And that assumes a certain kind of historical commonalities between China and Eastern European countries, how they actually became communist countries, or they functioned, operated as communist countries. And then, of course, there are, when you place China and Eastern European countries in that kind of comparative framework, you see similarities. And I would say we should compare orange and apple. We should. Because it is through that comparison we learned that one is apple, one is orange, but they belong to the same category, fruit. We should make that comparison. But the way to do that is we really need to have a really careful analysis of the apple, careful analysis of orange.
One group that does think it's worth comparing China with Russia is the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, who are obsessed with the fact that what happened to the Soviet Union could happen to China. So, I mean, I'm not alone in this.
De-center the West in understanding all this, but then not re-center China or India. I mean, we don't want to re-center and romanticize some new center.
Why should they be centered?
That's what I'm asking.
Well, who's saying they should be centered? I'm saying they should be. World has always been. No. I said it's reorientation. You see, the point is, we have been conditioned to think in a particular way in the last 200 years. Just imagine, again, to take back my previous example of what's happening in Denmark. Not that I'm an environmentalist, but I'm interested in what's happening there. If you look at the NGO contingent there, 95% are Western. Just imagine 10 years down the line, they're all Chinese. Because China has become so much more important. It has its own agenda about how the talk should go, and so we don't associate NGOs with non-Western world. We associate NGOs as independent voices, which are actually, coming from the West in most cases. Right? So, what I was going to say is that this idea of that there is a center which dominates the world, I don't buy that. What I'm trying to say is there is a shift in power, and that shift not going to go now. Even if we accept the most optimistic reports from people who study these things, and Rand Corporation and U.S. government. Even if China grows at the stage it's growing today, it'll be another generation before it reaches the level of U.S. And U.S. still will be far ahead of it in terms of economic and military power. So I don't think it's going to change that rapidly. But it's a question of there is not one single center. There are various centers of power, which in very old-fashioned balance of power system actually work as a kind of
Exactly what I'm contesting. Why should it be 7 or 8 centers of power in the world, the civilizations, Huntingtonian type civilization? Why should we talk about moving from a U.S. or a Western center to a China and India center?
Because, go ahead.
I think Daya addressed this in his earlier work. He used the wonderful term geolinguistic regions. So each region would have its own regional center, right? So that's one way of thinking about this. But then I would say even a regionalized but each region is a centralized system. It's still a center periphery. It's just a version, okay, a further complicated version of the original idea. But then if we go back and rethink, okay, how much percentage of the U.S. population belong to the global South? It has definitely increased in the past year, right? So we don't know about the people who are struggling, below the poverty line, all right? So that has definitely increased. So even in a country like U.S., the question of global South, is so present. So that's one way. I think that's why we need all this reorientation in order to, going back to the phrase that Daya just used, to rediscover and to confront the untold stories of globalization. Right? These connections between China and India, between China and Venezuela, between China and Namibia, right, with President Hu's son involved. Many stories are told, many stories are not told, precisely because we use one framework that's telling us what is to be told, what is not to be told, and that's the limitation. Is the first thing to go beyond, to even know where is China, right? China is also in Africa, China is also in Latin America, and in India, and I think that's lots of things we need to catch on in order just to get to the very basics. Even we can take what Professor Pan was advocating as the local approach to study all these new Chinese developments in Africa, in Latin America, and that's a huge gap.
All right, let's please give our applause for all our panelists today and thank them for their presentations. There will now be a 15-minute coffee break, conversation break.